Vinoba Bhave. The Silent Flame of India, Part 1. The Birth of a Seeker. On the 11th of September, 1895, in the humble village of Gagod in the Konkan belt of Maharashtra, a child was born who would one day ignite moral revolutions across the land. That child was Vinayak Narahar Bhave, later known to the world simply as Vinoba, a name that would echo with reverence among seekers of truth and justice. His was not the birth of royalty or privilege, but of simplicity, woven into the very soil of India's villages, where hunger and devotion often walked hand in hand. Vinayak, the eldest of 5 children, grew up under the shadow of traditions yet carried forward by the winds of change. His father, Narahar Shambhu Rao, was a man of rational thought and modern vision, a trained weaver who sought dignity in honest labor. His mother, Rukmini Devi, however, embodied faith and piety, a woman of deep spiritual temperament hailing from Karnataka. Between them, Vinayak inherited a dual inheritance, the clear-eyed reason of his father and the unwavering devotion of his mother. As a boy, Vinayak was not drawn to toys or idle chatter. Instead, he was captivated by scriptures and stories of saints. The Bhagavad Gita found its way into his young heart like a beacon of destiny. Its verses stirred him, igniting within him a flame that refused to die down. While other boys played in the dust of the lanes, Vinayak's eyes sparkled with questions about life, duty, and the divine. The Gita did not remain a book to him. It became his breath, his inner compass. Life in the Bhave household was disciplined but affectionate. Vinayak's siblings Balakrishna, Shivaji, Dattatreya, and their sister Shanti looked up to him. He was affectionately called Vinya, and even at that age, there was something in his demeanor that commanded quiet respect. When he spoke, it was as though he spoke from a well deeper than his years, as though an unseen guide whispered wisdom into his ear. But it was not merely in the warmth of his home that his destiny was shaped. The world outside was stirring. India, bound in the chains of British rule, was beginning to awaken to voices of resistance, whispers of freedom, and cries of dignity. In the newspapers that reached even small towns, the name of one man began to shine like a star: Mahatma Gandhi. For young Vinayak, Gandhi was not just a leader. He was a calling. When he read about Gandhi's address at Banaras Hindu University in 1916, something in him shifted. The words pierced his being like arrows of truth. Soon after, another article by Gandhi pushed him toward a decisive act of renunciation. One day, on his way to Bombay to appear for examinations, Vinayak stopped by the roadside, gathered his school and college certificates, and fed them to a fire. The flames leapt, crackled, and consumed the fragile paper. But in that fire was born a vow to seek a truer education, one not confined to classrooms and degrees, but rooted in service, sacrifice, and the search for truth. The act was radical, but for Vinayak, it was liberation. He was not abandoning learning. He was stepping into a higher school, one whose teacher he had yet to meet but already revered, Gandhi. Without hesitation, he wrote to the Mahatma, pouring out his heart. Gandhi, recognizing the earnestness in his words, invited him to the Vinoba Ashram in Ahmedabad. On June 7, 1916, a young, frail Vinayak, brimming with silent resolve, walked into the presence of Gandhi. That meeting was no ordinary encounter. It was the meeting of flame and wind. Gandhi saw in the young man a spirit of immense discipline and purity, someone destined not merely to follow but to extend the ideals of nonviolence and truth. Vinayak, in turn, felt that his life had found its axis, its anchor, its guiding star. From that day, he became Vinoba. At the Sabarmati Ashram, Vinoba immersed himself fully in the constructive programs Gandhi envisioned. spinning the charkha, teaching, sweeping, cleaning latrines, and tending to the community with humility. He was no mere participant, he was a devotee. The ashram's ideals of simplicity, self-reliance, and service resonated with his very soul. Whether teaching children or learning the art of weaving khadi, he treated each act as worship. The boy who had once gazed into the verses of the Gita now found those very teachings unfolding in action before his eyes. Duty without desire, service without pride, and sacrifice without fear, these were no longer abstractions. They became his way of life. Yet, this was only the beginning. From the village lanes of Gagod to the quiet huts of Sabarmati, Vinoba's journey had already begun to weave itself into the fabric of India's destiny. The silent seeker had found his path, and soon the whole nation would know his name. Part 2. The Ashram Years. A Disciple in the Making. When Vinoba arrived at the ashram in 1916, he came not as a visitor seeking comfort, but as a seeker prepared for renunciation. His meeting with Gandhi had already carved a turning point in his soul, and the ashram was to become his university, its classrooms, the humble huts, its teachers, the calloused hands of villagers, and its syllabus the lived philosophy of truth and nonviolence. From the very first day, Vinoba embraced the rhythm of ashram life as though he had always belonged there. Dawn would break with the chanting of prayers, and Vinoba's thin frame could be seen bent in devotion, his eyes reflecting both intensity and tranquility. After prayers, there was no idle leisure. The tasks of the ashram awaited sweeping floors, cleaning latrines, tending cows, drawing water, spinning yarn. To some, these chores might have seemed menial, but to Vinoba, they were acts of purification, ways to dissolve ego and cultivate humility. What struck his fellow ashramites was not just his willingness, but his joy in serving. While others labored dutifully, Vinoba worked as if each spin of the charkha, each broom stroke, was part of a greater yajna, a sacrifice for the upliftment of humanity. Gandhi noticed this. He often remarked on Vinoba's quiet intensity, his absence of complaint, his silent but steady perseverance. Here was a man, Gandhi thought, who could not only follow the path but illuminate it for others. Vinoba was not content with physical labor alone. He immersed himself in study, absorbing the works of Indian saints and philosophers, delving into scriptures, and reflecting upon their truths. At night, while others slept, his small lamp would burn as he read the Upanishads or wrestled with the profound verses of the Gita. When the Mahatma spoke of the Bhagavad Gita as his spiritual dictionary, Vinoba listened with the reverence of a student, and soon began giving talks on the Gita in his native Marathi to fellow ashramites. These talks, later compiled as Talks on the Gita, would ripple far beyond the ashram walls, nourishing generations to come. Despite his brilliance, Vinoba never allowed learning to become pride. His manner was simple, his speech soft, his gaze inward. He had no need for applause. His satisfaction lay in truth, and in aligning his life with it as best he could. Gandhi, ever discerning, saw in him not only a scholar but a man of profound discipline. His celibacy, embraced in youth, was not born of repression but of an unyielding vow to dedicate every ounce of his energy to the service of humanity. Gandhi respected him deeply for this, sometimes even with a touch of envy. For here was a man who had mastered his senses at such a tender age. The ashram gave Vinoba his first taste of leadership, though he never sought it. In 1921, when Gandhi asked him to move to Wardha and take charge of the ashram there, Vinoba did not hesitate. For him, the command of the Mahatma was not to be questioned, it was to be obeyed as though it came from the Gita itself. He set off to Warda on April 8, 1921, carrying little but his resolve, ready to nurture yet another community of seekers and servants. At Warda, his role expanded. He taught, wrote, and guided the ashram's residents, instilling in them the same reverence for simplicity and service that had taken root in his own heart. In 1923, he began publishing a Marathi monthly called Maharashtra Dharma. Its pages contained his reflections on the Upanishads, and through it, his voice reached beyond the walls of the ashram to touch the common people. The journal would soon grow into a weekly, and for 3 years it carried his spiritual essays, each infused with clarity and compassion. But Vinoba's work was never confined to words alone. In 1925, Gandhi entrusted him with a mission to Vaikam, in the southern state of Kerala, where the struggle for temple entry was raging. The so-called untouchables were forbidden from entering temples, and resistance was brewing. Vinoba's task was delicate: to guide, to console, and to strengthen the movement with the power of nonviolence. With quiet conviction, he traveled south, his very presence a balm, his words a bridge. The struggle was not just about entry into stone shrines, it was about the dignity of millions. Years passed, and the fire of freedom swept stronger across India. Vinoba did not stand at podiums rallying crowds, nor did he crave headlines. His contribution was quieter but no less profound. Arrests came, as they did for so many who challenged colonial power. The jails that swallowed others in despair became, for Vinoba, places of transformation. Behind bars, he turned cells into classrooms, prisons into sanctuaries of study. He wrote works like Ishavasya Vritti and Sthitaprajna Darshan. He learned 4 South Indian languages during his confinement, created a script he called Lok Nagari, and above all, he spoke on the Gita to fellow prisoners, bringing light into the darkest corners. Those who listened to him in the prisons of Vellore and elsewhere often came away changed. It was not just his words, but his being calm, unshaken, and suffused with compassion that left an impression. Where iron bars sought to confine him, his spirit soared freer than ever. He was proving, silently and steadily, that chains could never imprison truth. And yet, outside the ashram walls and prison gates, the world knew little of him. Unlike Gandhi, Nehru, or Patel, his name was not widely celebrated. But Gandhi saw what the nation had yet to see, when in 1940, he sought someone to be the very first individual satyagrahi, a lone protester standing against the might of the British Empire. He chose Vinoba. It was a moment that would finally bring him into the gaze of the nation, though Vinoba himself remained indifferent to fame. For him, it was simply another act of duty, another chapter in the Gita's unfolding within his life. The ashram years had shaped him, refined him, and readied him. He had walked as a disciple, absorbed as a student, served as a humble worker. Now, India would soon discover in him a teacher, a leader, and a flame quiet but unquenchable. Part 3. The Freedom Struggle, a Silent Warrior. By the late 1920s and 1930s, India's yearning for freedom had grown into a storm, and the colonial government's grip had begun to tremble. In the midst of this struggle, there stood men and women whose voices roared from podiums and filled the streets with slogans. But there was also Vinoba Bhave, his voice softer, his path quieter, yet his impact no less powerful. His presence was that of a flame hidden in a lamp, steady, illuminating, and inexhaustible. Vinoba's association with Gandhi had already marked him as a man of discipline and conviction. The ashram life had trained him in service, humility, and the pursuit of truth, but the call of the nation could not be ignored. When Gandhi announced campaigns of non-cooperation and civil disobedience, Vinoba did not hesitate. He walked into the struggle not with weapons or anger, but with unyielding faith in nonviolence. Prison as a place of pilgrimage arrests came quickly for those who defied British rule, and Vinoba was no exception. Yet where others saw jail as punishment, Vinoba saw opportunity. The stone walls and iron bars became for him not symbols of confinement, but of inner liberation. He called prison his university. There, he wrote, taught, and inspired. During his 5-year imprisonment in the 1940s, he produced works that revealed his depth of thought. Ishavasyavriti and Sthitaprajna Darshan flowed from his pen, reflections that tied philosophy with practical life. He did not merely write for scholars. His aim was always to make wisdom accessible to the common man. In Vellore jail, he even devised Lok Nagari, a simplified script that could bring literacy to those excluded from traditional learning. More than his writings, it was his talks that left a lasting impression. Standing before his fellow prisoners, many of them hardened men, Vinoba would recite and explain verses from the Gita in Marathi. The scripture, in his voice, was not an ancient relic but a living guide. To men surrounded by despair, he offered a vision of inner freedom. Even the guards, listening from a distance, felt the pull of his words. The jail that had been built to break spirits instead became, under his influence, a sanctuary of reflection. The first individual satyagrahi. It was in 1940, however, that Vinoba stepped into national prominence. Gandhi, planning a new campaign of truth and nonviolence, wanted to make a statement that resistance was not always about masses on the street, but about the solitary courage of one individual standing for truth. He needed someone to embody this principle, someone whose purity of heart and discipline of spirit could withstand the test. Gandhi chose Vinoba. On the 17th of October, 1940, Vinoba walked into history as the first individual satyagrahi. His protest was not fiery rhetoric, but a calm declaration of conscience. He stood against the British not with fists, but with truth, embodying the very essence of Gandhi's philosophy. For the first time, the nation turned its eyes toward this quiet man and saw in him a warrior of a different kind, unarmed yet unshakable. Vinoba was arrested, of course, as Gandhi knew he would be. Yet his courage set a pattern. Thousands followed, inspired by the idea that even one voice, raised in truth, could shake an empire. For Vinoba, it was not fame, but duty. When later asked about this moment, he simply smiled and said it was an offering at the feet of truth. The Quit India movement in 1942, as the Quit India movement surged like a tidal wave, Vinoba again stood shoulder to shoulder with Gandhi's followers. He courted arrest once more, not as an act of defiance, but as a natural consequence of living by principle. To him, prison was no interruption of life. It was simply another arena to practice service and reflection. Each arrest, each sentence, strengthened his resolve. Even within the tumult of the struggle, Vinoba remained committed to Gandhi's constructive programs, spinning khadi, promoting village industries, teaching hygiene, and advancing Nai Talim, a new system of education rooted in self-reliance and character building. He saw clearly that political freedom alone was insufficient. True Swaraj, true self-rule, had to begin with self-discipline, moral clarity, and service to the poorest. The celibate ascetic. Amid all this, Vinoba's personal discipline became the subject of quiet admiration. From adolescence, he had embraced celibacy as a vow, seeing it as a way to conserve his energy and dedicate his life entirely to service. Gandhi, who himself practiced brahmacharya, often spoke of Vinoba's purity with respect, sometimes even with envy. It was not merely an abstention, but an affirmation, a channeling of energy into a higher purpose. This vow gave Vinoba a strength that others could sense. His presence was serene, unshaken by temptations or distractions. His eyes reflected a clarity that came from within, and his life, uncluttered by personal attachments, stood as a testimony to self-mastery. Recognition, yet indifference to fame. By the end of the 1940s, Vinoba was no longer an obscure ashramite. His role in satyagraha, his writings, and his prison teachings had earned him recognition. Yet, unlike others who basked in political limelight, Vinoba remained detached. Fame was of no consequence to him. He did not crave followers, applause, or positions of power. His was the path of the inner revolution, and to that, he remained steadfast. His younger brother, Balkrishna, too followed Gandhi's path. Gandhi entrusted him, along with Manabai Desai, with setting up a nature therapy ashram at Urali Kanchan. There, Balkrishna devoted his entire life, embodying the same spirit of service. The Bhave family, it seemed, had found its destiny in Gandhian work, a nation at the brink. As India's independence drew near, the nation braced for both triumph and turmoil. For Vinoba, freedom was not the end, but the beginning. He foresaw that political liberty would mean little without social justice, without the upliftment of villages, without the healing of caste wounds, without the sharing of resources. The struggle against the British, in his eyes, was only the first chapter. The greater struggle was yet to come, the struggle against inequality, against poverty, against division. And so, as the flag of independence was about to rise, Vinoba's mind turned not to celebrations but to service. He was preparing, in silence, for the next great movement of his life, one that would redefine land, labor, and love in the heart of India. Part 4. The Seeds of Sarvodaya, a Vision Beyond Politics. With India's independence in 1947, the nation stood at the threshold of destiny. The Union Jack was lowered, the tricolor rose proudly, and the air rang with shouts of triumph. But for Vinoba Bhave, the true struggle had just begun. He had long understood that political freedom, though essential, was only the first step. Real liberation would remain incomplete until it touched the last man in the last village, until justice and dignity became the inheritance of all. Vinoba's vision was not merely of independence, but of Sarvodaya, the rise of all. It was a vision that transcended politics and rooted itself in spirituality, in the transformation of hearts. Unlike many leaders of the time who shifted their focus to governance, institutions, and power, Vinoba remained firmly on the path of service and spiritual activism. He was not drawn to parliament or ministries. His heart beat in the huts of villages, among peasants, weavers, and landless laborers. The broad religious outlook. At the center of Vinoba's worldview was his extraordinary religious inclusivity. His was a spirit that found truth not in one book or one faith, but in the symphony of all religions. His hymn, Om Tat Sat, captured this universality, weaving together symbols from Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and Jainism. For Vinoba, the divine was not bound by labels or dogma, it was a reality that united rather than divided. His slogan, Jai Jagat, victory to the world, echoed his belief that no nation could thrive in isolation, that the well-being of one was tied to the well-being of all. This universalism made him not only a saint for India, but a teacher for humanity. His spiritual vision was expansive, but it always returned to the ground, to the villages, to the people. Sarvodaya. Welfare for all. The Sarvodaya movement grew from this vision. Where politics sought to create policy, Sarvodaya sought to cultivate conscience. It asked not what the state could do, but what each individual could contribute. It was about dignity in labor, equality in relationships, simplicity in living, and compassion in action. Vinoba believed that society's foundation was broken. Caste divided, Poverty crushed, and greed corroded the soul of India. To rebuild, one could not rely solely on laws or government decrees. The transformation had to begin within, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. He taught that nonviolence was not merely a political tool but a way of life, and compassion was not weakness but strength. He observed closely the life of the average Indian villager, the small farmer, the landless laborer, the untouchable denied dignity, and he asked himself how their suffering could be alleviated in a way that honored their humanity. From these reflections, a new idea would emerge, one that would later shape his most famous contribution, the Bhoodan movement. The walk to Pochampally. It was in 1951, in a small village called Pochampally in Telangana, that Vinoba's vision took flesh. He had gone there on foot, as was his way, to meet with villagers and listen to their concerns. In one gathering, a group of 80 landless Harijan families came forward with desperation in their eyes. "Acharya," they pleaded, "we have no land to till, no means to live. What should we do?" Vinoba did not respond with theories or promises. Instead, he turned to the landlords who sat among them and asked, "Can you not consider me as your son, and these landless as your brothers? If a father has 6 sons, does he not share his land among them? Can you not give 1/6 of your land for your landless brothers?" A stunned silence followed. Then, as if moved by some higher force, a landlord stood and offered 100 acres of land for the poor. The assembly gasped, then erupted in joy. It was the birth of a movement, and Vinoba knew in that moment that this simple act of generosity could transform India. Bhoodan, the land gift movement. Thus began the Bhoodan movement, or land gift movement. Vinoba did not seek legislation, nor did he lead marches of protest. He walked, village to village, state to state, carrying nothing but his staff, his spinning wheel, and his faith. Wherever he went, he appealed to the conscience of landowners. "Give me land as you would give to your son, and I will give it to the landless." The results astonished even the skeptics. Across India, landlords came forward to donate millions of acres. Sometimes they gave a few, sometimes entire estates. By the mid-1950s, whole villages began to declare themselves as part of the movement, donating land collectively in what Vinoba called Gramdan Village Gift. In Tamil Nadu alone, 175 villages gave themselves over to this vision. Vinoba did not see himself as a reformer, but as a messenger. He believed he was merely a channel through which the spirit of generosity flowed. His voice was never accusatory, never demanding. Instead, it was gentle, persuasive, suffused with moral authority. He asked not out of compulsion but out of compassion, awakening the latent nobility in human hearts. Nonviolence in action. The Bhoodan movement was more than economic reform. It was nonviolence made visible. Where revolutions elsewhere seized land by force, Vinoba sought to heal the wound of inequality with love. To him, violence, whether by gun or by greed, could never bring lasting justice. Only voluntary sharing, born of inner transformation, could build a sustainable society. As he walked across India for 13 long years, covering over 58 kilometers, he spoke of his journey not as a burden, but as a blessing. "I have walked all over India," he once said, "and in the backdrop of the enduring perpetuity of my life's work, I have established 6 ashrams." To him, each step was a prayer, each gift of land a testament to humanity's capacity for compassion. A vision rooted in simplicity, though hailed across the nation, Vinoba remained untouched by pride. He lived as simply as ever, clad in khadi, sustained by modest meals, his heart open to all. He never hoarded wealth, nor sought political power. His wealth was the trust of the people, his power the purity of his intent. For him, the Bhudin movement was not just about land. It was about the spirit of sharing, about breaking down the barriers of caste, class, and creed. It was about restoring the dignity of the poorest, about weaving a society where each saw the other as kin. In his quiet way, Vinoba had begun a second freedom struggle, not against foreign rulers, but against poverty, injustice, and the selfishness of the human heart. Part V. The Long Walks. Bhudan and Gramdan. The movement that had been born in Pochampally in April 1951 was like the first ripple in a pond. From that single act of generosity, waves began to spread across India, carrying with them the seeds of a revolution rooted not in violence but in compassion. Vinoba Bhave, staff in hand and clad in simple khadi, took to the roads. For the next 13 years, he would walk across the length and breadth of India, speaking not in the thunderous voice of a political agitator, but in the quiet, persuasive tone of a teacher and a brother. The Bhudin Yatra begins. The Bhudin Yatra, the walk for land gifts, was unlike any other campaign in the history of India. Vinoba did not march with armies of followers, nor did he demand wealth through threats or decrees. He walked humbly from village to village, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a handful of companions. He would gather the villagers, sit among them as an equal, and tell the story of Pochampally. His appeal was simple. If you consider me as your son, give me a share of your land, so that I may give it to your landless brothers and sisters. This appeal touched something deep in the hearts of people. Often landlords, after initial hesitation, would come forward and donate a portion of their land. Some gave a few acres, others gave hundreds. In some cases, entire communities joined together to gift land. By the time the movement gained momentum, thousands of acres had been collected and distributed to the landless. Vinoba did not record these as mere numbers. Each acre represented a moral awakening, a moment when greed was loosened and compassion prevailed. For him, every gift of land was a step towards Sarvodaya, the welfare of all. Gramdan, the gift of villages. By 1954, Vinoba's vision expanded. If individual donations could change lives, what if entire villages embraced the principle of sharing? Thus was born the idea of Gramdan, the donation of whole villages. Under Gramdan, all the land of a village would be pooled and managed collectively, with ownership shared by the community. This was not just economic reform. It was a radical social experiment, an attempt to reimagine village life around equality, cooperation, and nonviolence. The idea spread. By the mid-1950s, more than 1,000 villages had offered themselves to Gramdan. In Tamil Nadu alone, 175 villages took the pledge. Though implementation was not always perfect, the symbolic power of the act was profound. For the first time, communities were declaring that land was not a commodity but a shared trust, that wealth was not to be hoarded but to be distributed in the spirit of kinship. The journey on foot Vinoba's Yatra was an odyssey. He walked over 58 kilometers more than the circumference of the earth. His sandals wore thin, his feet grew calloused, but his spirit remained untired. Through blazing heat, torrential rains, and dusty roads, he pressed on. Villagers would gather to welcome him, sometimes showering him with flowers, sometimes offering only water and shelter. He asked for nothing but the chance to speak to their hearts. The sight of him slender, serene, his eyes shining with compassion moved people. Unlike politicians who arrived with pomp, Vinoba's simplicity was his power. He carried no possessions beyond his staff, his spinning wheel, and a bundle of scriptures. Wherever he stopped, he would sit with villagers, eat what they ate, sleep where they slept. He lived among them as one of their own. The philosophy in action, the Bhudin and Gramdan movements, were not merely about land redistribution. They were about building a society on the foundation of love, trust, and voluntary sharing. Vinoba saw land as more than soil. It was life, dignity, and security. To deny land to the landless was to deny them humanity. He rejected the idea that justice had to come through coercion or legislation. Instead, he believed that true justice could only come through the awakening of conscience. Laws could change behavior, but only love could change hearts. By asking for voluntary gifts, Vinoba was testing the moral fiber of society, calling forth its noblest instincts. This philosophy was radical in its gentleness. Where revolutions elsewhere seized land through violence and bloodshed, Vinoba's revolution unfolded in quiet conversations, in the opening of hands and hearts. It was an experiment in nonviolence taken beyond politics and applied to economics and social life. Challenges and criticisms. Of course, the movement was not without its challenges. Not every land donation was free of motive. Some landlords gave away barren or unproductive land, keeping the fertile plots for themselves. Others saw it as a way to avoid future land reforms imposed by the government. Implementation of Gramdan was uneven, and many donated lands remained disputed or unutilized. Critics argued that the movement was too idealistic, too dependent on voluntary goodwill in a society deeply entrenched in inequality. Some saw it as a way for landlords to maintain moral authority without truly dismantling feudal structures. Vinoba, however, was undeterred. He accepted imperfections as part of the process. For him, even if a portion of the donations were insincere, the fact remained that hearts had been touched, conversations had begun, and a new moral possibility had been glimpsed. He was planting seeds for the future, seeds that might take generations to bear fruit. A nation's response. Despite criticisms, the movement captured the imagination of the nation. Leaders from across the political spectrum praised Vinoba's efforts. To the poor, he became Acharya the teacher, one who not only preached but practiced. To intellectuals, he was a philosopher in action, proving that nonviolence could be applied to the most practical of human problems. Internationally, too, his work drew attention. At a time when revolutions in other parts of the world were drenched in blood, Vinoba's land gift movement stood as a shining example of moral power. In 1958, he was awarded the Ramon Magsaysay Award for Community Leadership, recognition of his unique approach to social transformation. The Pilgrim of Compassion. Through it all, Vinoba remained unchanged. Fame did not touch him, nor did recognition inflate him. He saw himself simply as a pilgrim, walking the land of India, carrying in his heart the teachings of the Gita and the spirit of Gandhi. He was not building an empire, nor seeking a legacy. His aim was to awaken, to sow, to inspire, whether his work was remembered or forgotten, whether his dreams succeeded or failed. He believed it was enough to have walked in truth. The Bhudan and Gramdan movements were his offering to India, a vision of a society bound not by greed but by generosity, not by violence but by love. And though the path was fraught with difficulties, Vinoba's footsteps continued, steady as the ticking of a clock, leaving behind a trail of hope across the villages of India. Part 6. Brahma Vidya Mandir, a community of spirit. By the late 1950s, Vinoba Bhave had already traversed thousands of miles, gathering land not for himself but for the landless. His name had become synonymous with moral authority and nonviolent revolution. Yet, he was not content to stop at Bhudan and Gramdan. His restless spirit sought new ways of embodying truth, love, and service. Out of this yearning was born one of his most profound experiments, Brahma Vidya Mandir, the temple of the knowledge of the Absolute. The vision for a new ashram, founded in 1959 in Paner, a small town in Maharashtra. Brahma Vidya Mandir, BVM, was not just another ashram. It was a community designed to test, in practice, whether nonviolence could truly be the basis of collective life. Vinoba envisioned it as a place where spiritual discipline, self-reliance, and social service were woven together into a living experiment. What made BVM especially remarkable was its focus on women. Vinoba believed that women carried within them a special capacity for compassion, patience, and endurance qualities essential for the nonviolent transformation of society. He wanted women to stand not behind men, but alongside them, as equal torchbearers of a new way of life. Thus, BVM was founded as a women's community, though later a few men were also admitted. It was a bold step. In a society still bound by patriarchy, where women were often confined to kitchens and homes, Vinoba opened a door for them to become pioneers of spiritual and social change. Daily life at the Mandir life in Brahmavidya Mandir was austere yet deeply nourishing. The members lived simply, growing their own food, spinning their own cloth, and practicing collective decision-making. There was no hierarchy of power, no pursuit of wealth, no competition. Instead, there was shared labor, shared prayers, and shared purpose. Their day began at dawn, with the chanting of the Isha Upanishad, its verses reminding them that everything in the universe belongs to the divine, and nothing should be possessed in greed. By mid-morning, they recited the Vishnu Sahasranama, a litany of the 1,000 names of God, affirming the infinite forms of the divine presence. In the evenings, the Bhagavad Gita was recited, the scripture that had been the very heartbeat of Vinoba's own life. These prayers were not ritual alone, they were the community's compass. They reminded each member that their work in the fields, their weaving, their cooking, and their care for one another were all sacred acts, part of the same offering to truth. Nonviolence in agriculture. Perhaps the most radical experiment of BVM lay in its approach to agriculture. In a world increasingly turning to industrial methods and chemical fertilizers, Vinoba asked, could food be grown without violence? Could the soil be treated not as a commodity but as a living partner? At BVM, agriculture became an act of reverence. No plowing that harmed living creatures in the soil was encouraged. Instead, techniques rooted in compassion and sustainability were sought. Crops were grown with minimal disturbance, using organic methods long before the word became fashionable. The aim was not maximum profit, but harmony with the land, with animals, with each other. This was not easy. The yields were modest, the labor hard, but the women of BVM embraced it with devotion. For them, growing food nonviolently was an extension of prayer, a way of embodying Gandhi's principle that means and ends must be consistent. Radical democracy in practice. Equally striking was the way decisions were made at Brahma Vidya Mandir. There was no central authority, no leader issuing orders. Instead, decisions were taken collectively, through dialogue and consensus. Each voice mattered, and the process of listening itself became a form of spiritual discipline. This radical democracy was Vinoba's attempt to show that true freedom was not only political but social. If India was to be truly free, its villages, families, and communities would have to learn the art of self-governance rooted in respect, equality, and cooperation. At BVM, this was practiced every day. Challenges and perseverance. The life of simplicity and nonviolence was not without its difficulties. Resources were scarce, the labor unending, and the world outside often dismissed their efforts as impractical or idealistic. The pressures of modern agriculture, the lure of consumerism, and the skepticism of outsiders weighed on the community. Yet, BVM endured. Its members, bound by shared conviction, found strength in one another. They were not building a model for the masses, but nurturing a seed of possibility, a living example that another way of life was possible, even if small, even if fragile. The message to the world. Vinoba often described Brahma Vidya Mandir as his laboratory. Just as scientists test theories in controlled environments, he was testing whether the principles of nonviolence, truth, and self-sufficiency could truly sustain a community. The results were modest in scale, but profound in spirit. In a world increasingly obsessed with industrial growth and consumer culture, BVM stood as a quiet challenge. It whispered a different narrative, that communities could live with less, share more, and treat both land and life with reverence. Its influence was small, but for those who encountered it, the experience was unforgettable. Even today, the community continues, with about 25 women at its heart. They carry forward the same routines of prayer, farming, and collective living, embodying Vinoba's vision across decades. In their persistence lies a reminder that revolutions do not always roar with slogans. Sometimes they whisper in the rhythm of daily life. Vinoba's larger dream. For Vinoba, Brahma Vidya Mandir was not an isolated project, but part of the larger Sarvodaya movement. It was one strand in a tapestry that included Bhudan, Gramdan, and countless acts of service. Each experiment, whether successful or not, was a step toward the dream of a society based on love and justice rather than greed and violence. He knew that BVM would never rival the scale of industrial agriculture, nor would it reshape the entire economy. But that was not its purpose. Its purpose was to prove, however humbly, that a nonviolent community was possible. If even a handful of people could live this way, it meant that humanity had not lost its way entirely. A temple without walls. In naming it Brahma Vidya Mandir, Vinoba had chosen well. It was indeed a temple, though not of stone or marble. Its walls were fields of grain. Its deities were the ideals of truth and nonviolence. Its priests were ordinary women working the soil with devotion. In its quiet persistence, it stood as one of the most touching legacies of Vinoba's life, a reminder that the sacred is not only in scriptures, but in the sweat of labor done with love. Part 7. The Scholar and the Sage. Vinoba's Literary Journey. Though history remembers Vinoba Bhave as a reformer, a walker of countless miles, and the architect of Bhutan, another dimension of his life was equally profound. His identity as a thinker, scholar, and interpreter of India's spiritual heritage. His pen was as active as his feet, and his words carried the same humility, clarity, and force of truth as his action. For Vinoba, writing was never about building reputation. It was about service, making wisdom accessible to all. The voice of the Gita. If there was one text that defined Vinoba's inner life, it was the Bhagavad Gita. He often said, "The Gita is the breath of my life." From his youth, its verses had been his constant companion, guiding him through doubt, solitude, and action. At the ashram, he had begun giving talks on the Gita in Marathi, interpreting its teachings for his fellow seekers. These talks were delivered with simplicity, without ornamentation, yet they carried a depth that stirred hearts. His talks were later compiled into the celebrated book Gita, meaning Mother Gita in Marathi. It was not a scholarly commentary filled with abstruse arguments, but a heartfelt rendering that spoke to ordinary people. By giving the Gita a voice in the mother tongue of the people, Vinoba achieved what few had done. He brought philosophy down from the lofty towers of pundits and placed it into the hands of farmers, laborers, and homemakers. Gita became more than a book. It became a living scripture for countless Marathi households. Its pages were read not as a distant philosophical treatise, but as intimate counsel from a teacher who walked among them. To this day, in villages across Maharashtra, families still recite verses from Gita as part of their daily prayers. A polyglot and interpreter, Vinoba's genius extended far beyond Marathi. He was a polyglot with mastery over several languages: Marathi, Kannada, Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, English, and Sanskrit. And during his prison years, he even learned multiple South Indian languages. His facility with tongues was not an academic pursuit but an act of love. For him, every language was a doorway into the heart of a people, and every script a vessel of culture. He once called the Kannada script the queen of world scripts, Vishwa Lipigala Rani, marveling at its elegance and grace. To him, each script was not merely a tool of writing but an artistic expression of civilization. His reverence for language was matched by his reverence for scripture. He studied the Bible, the Quran, the works of Adi Shankaracharya, and the poetry of Dhanyaneshwar and other Marathi saints. But unlike many scholars who critiqued with detachment, Vinoba approached these texts with openness. He sought what was true and nourishing in each, drawing out their essence without sectarian bias. His writings on these works showed not only his intellectual breadth but also his spiritual generosity. He was, in the truest sense, a bridge builder between traditions. Writing as Service Vinoba's literary output was vast, but he never wrote for fame. His books, essays, and translations were seen as extensions of his service. Just as he distributed land to the landless, he distributed knowledge to the curious. He believed wisdom should never be hoarded, never wrapped in elitism, but shared freely in simple language, so that even the unlettered could taste its sweetness. In his prison writings we see this clearly. Works like Ishavasya Vritti, a commentary on the Isha Upanishad, and Sthitaprajna Darshan were born not in the comfort of libraries but within the stark confines of jail cells. Yet these commentaries radiated serenity and insight, showing how confinement could not diminish his inner freedom. Talks on the Gita, among his most influential works was Talks on the Gita, compiled from his expositions at Sabarmati and later in prisons. These talks were conversational, intimate, and deeply practical. Vinoba insisted that the Gita was not a book to be worshipped from afar, but a manual for daily living. To him, Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, was not about grand gestures, but about the dignity of small acts done with sincerity. When he spoke of detachment, it was not in abstract metaphysical terms, but in the context of sweeping floors, spinning yarn, or walking miles for the poor. His interpretations made the Gita a living companion for ordinary people. It was this gift, the gift of making the eternal relevant, that set Vinoba apart as a teacher. The philosopher of simplicity. Unlike academic philosophers, Vinoba did not delight in argument or complexity. His philosophy was born of lived experience, expressed in aphorisms as clear as water. He believed that truth, if genuine, should be simple enough for a child to understand. This simplicity did not mean superficiality. On the contrary, his writings showed profound insight into the nature of human greed, the roots of violence, and the possibilities of nonviolent living. He insisted that nonviolence was not merely abstaining from harm, but actively cultivating love and compassion. Similarly, he saw freedom not as independence from rulers, but as mastery over one's own desires and ego. Criticism and independence of mind. Not all admired him unconditionally. Some critics, including the writer V.S. Naipaul, accused him of excessive idealism or blind devotion to Gandhi. Others mocked his support for certain political decisions, such as his controversial backing of Indira Gandhi's emergency, which he called Anushasan Parva, time for discipline. But even in criticism, one saw his independence of mind. Vinoba did not seek popularity. He spoke what he believed, even if it alienated allies. For him, truth was never subject to vote or applause. His courage lay not in shouting against the crowd, but in standing quietly for what his conscience dictated. Teacher to a nation. Above all, Vinoba was a teacher. Not a teacher in the conventional sense, with blackboard and chalk, but one whose entire life was a lesson. His simplicity was a teaching. His silence was a teaching. His refusal to hoard wealth or power was a teaching. His willingness to walk across the land, barefoot and unarmed, was perhaps his greatest sermon. He was rightly called a Charya teacher, and unlike many who carried the title, Vinoba's teaching was not through words alone but through example. For him, to translate the Gita into Marathi was one act of service. To translate it into his very life was the greater act. Legacy of the writer-sage. The India of Vinoba's time was a land searching for direction. Amid the din of politics and the lure of industrial progress, his writings were like a soft bell, calling the nation back to conscience. His translations and commentaries did not merely preserve tradition. They made tradition breathe anew. His reflections on language, religion, and philosophy revealed an intellect both wide and deep, yet always humble. Vinoba Bhave's literary and intellectual contributions remain one of the most enduring parts of his legacy. In his books, as in his life, we encounter not the pomp of a scholar but the quiet radiance of a sage, a man who sought not to dominate thought but to illuminate it, to make it accessible, to share it as freely as he shared land. Part 8. The Last Pilgrimage. Vinoba's final years and passing. By the late 1970s, Vinoba Bhave had become a moral figure whose presence commanded reverence across India. He was not a politician, nor did he sit in parliament or hold office. Yet when he spoke, the nation listened. His Bhoodan and Gramdan movements had altered the moral landscape of India, his writings had inspired countless seekers, and his experiments in community life had offered living alternatives to industrial modernity. But age was catching up to the pilgrim of compassion. His frame, always slender, grew frailer. His hair, once dark, had turned white as cotton. Yet the fire in his eyes remained undimmed. Withdrawal into silence. As he entered his 80s, Vinoba began to withdraw from public life. He had walked thousands of miles, written and spoken thousands of words, and given decades of service. Now he chose to retreat into silence at his beloved Brahma Vidya Mandir in Paunar Wardha district of Maharashtra. Here, among the women who carried on his experiment of nonviolent living, he spent his days in prayer, reflection, and simple labor. Silence, for Vinoba, was not emptiness, but fullness. It was a way of listening more deeply to the voice within. Visitors who came to see him often found him serene, his words fewer but sharper, as if distilled through years of contemplation. For him, the outer work of marching and speaking had been done. The inner work of preparing for departure had begun. The controversy of the emergency. Even in these years, controversy touched him. When Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared the emergency in 1975, suspending civil liberties and silencing dissent, many expected Vinoba to denounce the move. Instead, he described it as Anushasan Parva, a time for discipline. Critics accused him of lending moral legitimacy to authoritarian rule, and some mockingly labeled him the Sarkari Sant, the government saint. This stance cost him admiration among sections of the public. Yet, true to his nature, Vinoba did not bend to popularity. He had always believed that discipline was essential to freedom, and though his interpretation of the emergency was seen as naive or misguided, it reflected his unwavering commitment to principle as he understood it. His supporters defended him, saying he was guided not by politics, but by his lifelong quest for order and truth. Still, the controversy revealed how even saints are not immune to the sharp edge of history's judgment. Preparing for departure, by the early 1980s, Vinoba sensed that his journey was nearing its end. In keeping with his deep spiritual convictions, he made a choice that reflected both courage and detachment. He embraced Samadhi Maran, also known in Jain tradition as Santhara, the conscious decision to fast unto death. This was not suicide in despair, but a final act of surrender. Vinoba believed that just as one should live consciously, one should also die consciously. Eating and taking medicine, he felt, were no longer necessary for a body whose task was complete. On November 7, 1982, he announced his decision to stop taking food and water. His followers, though heartbroken, respected his wish. For days, he lay in his simple room at Ponar, surrounded by disciples who chanted scriptures softly, filling the air with a quiet reverence. He was not in pain, nor did he resist the fading of life. His face remained calm, his eyes sometimes opening to bless those around him. The man who had walked so much of India now prepared to walk into eternity. The final breath. On 15 November 1982, at the age of 87, Vinoba Bhave breathed his last. The nation mourned the passing of one of its purest souls. News spread quickly. The Acharya was no more. In villages and towns, people lit lamps in his honor. In ashrams and homes, prayers were recited. At that very moment, far away in Moscow, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was attending the funeral of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. On hearing of Vinoba's death, she immediately cut short her visit and rushed back to India to attend his funeral. Such was the weight of his presence. Even in his death, he commanded the attention of the highest leaders. His funeral was a simple affair, in keeping with his life. Thousands gathered, not to watch a spectacle, but to offer their gratitude. His body was laid to rest in Ponar, the soil he had loved, among the community he had nurtured. There were no grand monuments, no elaborate rituals, only the tears of those he had touched and the silence of a grateful land. The afterglow of Vinoba's death left a void, but his spirit remained woven into the fabric of India. His words, his writings, his footsteps across villages all became part of the country's memory. In 1983, the government of India posthumously awarded him the Bharat Ratna, the nation's highest civilian honor. It was a recognition not of power or wealth, but of moral greatness. To those who had known him, however, no award could capture his essence. He had lived as a pilgrim, asking for nothing, giving everything. He had walked without shoes of power, without the armor of politics, armed only with faith in truth and nonviolence. And when his time came, he had left as he had lived gently, humbly, in silence. The meaning of his passing, Vinoba's practice of Samadhi Maran stirred deep debate in India. Was it right to embrace death in this way? Some saw it as an act of supreme spiritual courage, a final assertion of mastery over body and desire. Others questioned whether it was an escape. But for Vinoba, there was no doubt. He had always lived by the principle that life was a gift to be used in service, and once its purpose was fulfilled, one should not cling to it. His death, like his life, was an offering. For his disciples and admirers, his passing was not an end, but a call to continue his work. The Budan lands needed cultivation. The Gramdan villages needed nurturing. The principles of Sarvodaya needed champions. In that sense, Vinoba had not left. He had simply handed the torch to others. A saint of the people. In the decades since his death, Vinoba Bhave has remained a figure of both reverence and debate. Some remember him as a saint, the spiritual heir of Gandhi, the Acharya who gave away land with words alone. Others point to the limitations of his movements, the criticisms of his politics, and the controversies of his later years. Yet, perhaps his greatness lies precisely in this complexity. He was not flawless, nor did he claim to be. He was human, gentle, stubborn, visionary, sometimes misunderstood. But through it all, he remained faithful to one principle, that truth and nonviolence are the only foundations on which humanity can build a just world. In his death, as in his life, Vinoba reminded India that revolutions need not be violent, that power need not corrupt, and that one man walking with faith can change the destiny of millions. Part 9. Legacy of a Silent Flame. Vinoba's Enduring Relevance. When the ashes of Vinoba Bhave settled into the soil of Poner, many wondered what his life had meant in the grand sweep of history. Was he a saint or a reformer, a dreamer or a pragmatist, a follower of Gandhi or a thinker in his own right? In truth, he was all of these, and more. His life was a tapestry woven of contradictions and consistencies, failures and triumphs, humility and grandeur. In his quiet way, he had given India a vision that continues to resonate, even in the fractured landscapes of the present. A teacher for the nation. Above all, Vinoba was known as Acharya the teacher. But unlike most teachers, he did not stand behind a desk or wield chalk upon a blackboard. His entire life was the lesson. When he gave away his certificates to the flames, he taught that true education lies in truth, not in degrees. When he swept the ashram floors, he taught that dignity belongs to labor, not status. When he walked barefoot across India, he taught that the smallest steps, taken with sincerity, can transform nations. In his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, Gita, he showed how ancient wisdom could speak to modern struggles. In his Buddhan and Gramdan movements, he demonstrated that economics could be grounded in ethics, and that generosity could be a tool of revolution. In Brahma Vidya Mandir, he proved that women could be pioneers of nonviolence and self-sufficiency. Every experiment, every act, was a chapter in his living textbook on truth. The criticisms he faced, yet no legacy is without shadows. Vinoba was not universally admired. Many intellectuals accused him of being too idealistic, too detached from the harsh realities of power and politics. Some argued that Putin allowed landlords to donate barren or unproductive land while holding onto the fertile portions, thereby preserving old inequalities. Others noted that Gramdan villages often failed to sustain collective ownership in practice. His political stances, too, drew ire. His support of Indira Gandhi's emergency, which he called Anushasan Parva, time for discipline, shocked many admirers who expected him to oppose authoritarian rule. Critics labeled him a Sarkari Sant, a government saint, implying that his moral authority had been co-opted by those in power. Writers like V.S. Naipaul dismissed him as excessively imitative of Gandhi, lacking independent rationality. Even among Gandhians, some whispered that Vinoba's devotion to Gandhi bordered on blind reverence. And Marathi satirist P.K. Atra mocked him in an essay titled Vanaroba, a pun on his name, turning Vinoba into monkey. But Vinoba himself remained unfazed by these criticisms. He had never sought popularity. He often reminded his followers that truth was not a matter of numbers or applause. To him, even if his work was misunderstood or mocked, the duty remained the same: to live in harmony with conscience. Recognition and honors. Despite criticisms, the world did not fail to recognize his greatness. In 1958, he became the first recipient of the Ramon Magsaysay Award for community leadership, acknowledging the transformative power of the Buddhan movement. After his passing, in 1983, he was awarded the Bharat Ratna, India's highest civilian honor, cementing his place among the most revered figures of the nation. His life also inspired cinema. In 1951, filmmaker Sarvaram Badami created a documentary simply titled Vinoba Bhave. In 1963, Vishram Bedekar directed Vinoba Bhave, The Man. Produced by the Government of India's Films Division, these films sought to capture the aura of a man who carried no weapons, no wealth, no office, only a staff, a spinning wheel, and the power of truth. The relevance of his ideas today. In today's world, where consumerism drives economies, where violence and division often dominate headlines, Vinoba's voice seems more relevant than ever. His insistence that means must be consistent with ends is a reminder in an age where progress is often pursued at any cost. His dream of Sarvodaya, the rise of all, remains a powerful antidote to societies fractured by inequality. The Bhutan and Gramdan movements may not have solved India's land question in a lasting way, but they posed a moral challenge that is timeless. Can we live not as competitors, but as kin? Can generosity replace greed as the basis of society? These questions remain unanswered, yet they haunt us still. Similarly, Brahma Vidya Mandir, though small and obscure in the shadow of global agribusiness, continues to embody a truth that modern civilization resists. That food can be grown without violence, that communities can thrive without exploitation, that sustainability is not just technical but spiritual. In times of ecological crisis, Vinoba's experiments in nonviolent agriculture and simple living appear prophetic. He rejected the myth that large-scale industrial farming was the only path to feeding humanity. Instead, he showed how humility, cooperation, and reverence for the soil could sustain life. The silent flame. Perhaps the greatest gift of Vinoba Bhave lies not in his movements or his writings, but in his example. He was a man who walked with serenity in turbulent times, who believed in the power of persuasion over coercion, who trusted in the hidden nobility of the human heart. He was not a fiery orator like Gandhi, not a strategist like Nehru, not a mass mobilizer like Patel. His flame was quieter, almost invisible at times, but it burned steadily, refusing to be extinguished. His silence spoke louder than speeches. His simplicity carried more weight than power. To those who met him, he left an impression not of grandeur but of peace. To those who read him, he left an impression not of brilliance alone but of clarity. To those who walked with him, he left an impression not of command but of companionship. The legacy lives on today. Institutions carry his name: the Vinoba Bhave University in Jharkhand, countless ashrams, and organizations rooted in Sarvodaya principles. But more than in bricks or plaques, his legacy survives in the living memory of villages where land was given, in the women of Brahma Vidya Mandir who still recite the Gita at dawn, in the students who still read Gita at night. His legacy also survives in the questions he left behind. How much land does one man need? How much can one consume without harming another? Can nonviolence be more than the absence of war? Can it be the very principle of life? Vinoba never claimed to have all the answers, but he asked the questions with such sincerity that they continue to stir consciences long after his passing. Closing reflections. In the final accounting, Vinoba Bhave was not merely Gandhi's disciple, nor merely India's national teacher. He was a bridge between the spiritual and the social, the ancient and the modern, the personal and the political. He carried the Gita not in his pocket but in his breath. He carried nonviolence not as a tactic but as a way of being. He carried India not as a nation-state but as a family. His life was a pilgrimage without end, his death a final surrender, his legacy a challenge still alive. Vinoba Bhave, the silent flame, continues to burn not in monuments or medals, but in the hearts of all who dare to believe that love is stronger than violence, generosity greater than greed, and truth mightier than empires.